Hello, we're back again. May's with me this time to help me out. Our series of studies has been on evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And as I said at the start, we are considering the material we have from the Bible, very little bit outside, but most of it from the Bible, as evidence we could recommend to someone who doesn't already believe the Bible, but they're open to belief. And we want to see what kind of a case we can put together in historical terms. And we're reviewing first our primary sources of information. So we'll continue with that, but let's open with prayer first. So, Father, we thank you that we can take up this issue of the resurrection of your Son, the evidence that we have been left, the importance of that to belief and faith, with the goal of salvation and glorifying you. So bless our discussion at this time and provide us with your Spirit in his name. Amen. All right. So we have reviewed our biblical sources, which were 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's statement about Jesus dying, buried, raised, and making multiple appearances to his disciples. Then we looked at Matthew and Mark, both of which focused on appearances that Jesus promised to make, or at least an appearance that was promised to the disciples in Galilee. And Matthew actually narrates it. Mark, in its original ending, does not. Then we looked at Luke, which focused on appearances of Jesus in or near the city of Jerusalem. There were two of those. And then there is a version of that in Acts, which I kind of count that as a continuation of Luke. At least it's from the same author. And it's, you might say it's supplemental to what we find in Luke's chapter 24. So we looked at that. And then finally at John, where we had three appearances of Jesus, two after he was raised, two in the city of Jerusalem, and then one in Galilee. Then we went back and looked at the long ending of Mark, which was an account. It doesn't quite flow smoothly from Mark. There much manuscript evidence that it is, in fact, an addition, but it seems to combine elements from Luke and John. And so it's important as confirmation of those, or an additional testimony to those. There's a short ending of Mark, which provides almost no information, but we did read that briefly. So those are our biblical materials, and we're going to go back and analyze those in some detail. But there is one source, I said, from the first century outside the Bible, and that's the Jewish historian Josephus. Josephus fought against the Romans, then he defected to the Romans, and he wrote a history of the Jewish people called Antiquities of the Jews, and then another book called Wars of the Jews, a couple of other more minor works. And because he is from the first century, and really our only other source from, you might say, historically, the neighborhood of the events themselves of Jesus' death, we want to take a look at what is in his writings. And May's here to help me. She's going to read one of these, and then I'll read the other. This is from Antiquities of the Jews. I just want to remind myself of the reference. So if you want to look this up, it's from Book 18, passages 63 and 64. That's in the newer referencing system. But you could also just go online, if you're interested, and look this up on Wikipedia. It's called a Testimonium Flavionum, or words very close to that. But you can find it fairly quickly, and they will give you some information discussing it. And you can find the text online if you're really of a mind to do that and you want to hunt it up. But we're going to read it now. So this is from near the end of the first century, Jewish historian giving us information on Jesus. And there's actually two separate references that we're going to read, but this one is has the most information. So we'll start with it. So May, if you would read it for us, please.
Okay. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, that those loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. This and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day.
Okay, so if you caught that, he says Jesus is a doer of wonderful works, drew uh, people, both Jews and Gentiles, was condemned, but his followers saw him alive again on the third day. So that's why we're reading this, because it has an account of the resurrection appearance. It says they saw him again, no details, of course, but it does say that. And it says the tribe of the Christians named for him are still around. They're not they haven't died out or gone extinct as of the time of the writing of it. Now, there is a major problem with this passage as evidence, and that is that the statements that he was the Christ, that his followers saw him alive on the third day, that he was, it said at one point near the start of the passage, he was a man, if it be lawful to call him a man. It makes him superhuman, in effect. All of these statements would only be made by a Christian. Okay, is only a Christian is going to make these statements like he was the Christ. Okay, so that's just confessing yourself to be a Christian, really, if you say that. And the problem is, okay, ma'am, take this book. Okay, if you look at this book, if you get Josephus, there's thousands upon thousands of words that he wrote. He wrote long histories of the Jews, including a long history of the first Jewish revolt and the events surrounding it, the wars of the Jews. And nowhere else does Josephus say anything that a Christian would say in all the different places where a Christian would would note things. There's nothing about the apostles. There's nothing about Jesus, a prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem. There's just absolutely nothing else that would lead you to believe that Josephus really thought that Jesus of Nazareth was the promised Messiah. It's just unreasonable, really, to think that a man who would never show any Christian tendencies in his voluminous writings, both before and after, would have written this as you heard May read it, as if it were a Christian tract. And even though I've even heard on the radio some preachers read this as if it genuinely comes from Josephus, when just no serious historian or scholar that I've ever read believes that Josephus wrote it as we have it. However, there are some key phrases in this passage that also don't sound like a Christian scribe speaking. And that is our best explanation, that this passage was doctored by a Christian scribe who felt that a testimony to Jesus was needed here. So in copying Josephus, he added some little notes that seemed to him to respect Jesus's true identity and role in God's purpose. So this Christian scribe felt entitled to add them in. And it's not our only instance of that, believe me, or something like that happening. But because there are some distinctly non-Christian phrases in it. A great many scholars, I don't know if it would be a large majority, but probably majority, I would say, believe that there is a portion of this or portions of this passage that are originally from Josephus. And although it's impossible to construct it, to reconstruct what Josephus might have written with 100% certainty, given the rest of his writings, his attitude as a Jew who does not sound Christian anywhere else, and these strange phrases, like, for example, it says that he was a doer of wonderful works, something like that. Mm-hmm. That would be unlikely to be a way that a Christian scribe would describe Jesus. Or the phrase, for example, the tribe of the Christians. That's not the way the early church referred to believers, as a tribe or others, or the Christian scribe would be likely to refer to them. Or even the note where it says they did not forsake him even after his death. That would be a strange way to say that Christians had faith that Jesus was alive and was still their Lord. To say after his death they didn't leave off him, or at least it's a little bit awkward to presume that as the writings of a Christian scribe. So I have an example of what is probably something close to what Josephus originally wrote. And like I said, there are different reconstructions. This one I'm going to read you is by a New Testament scholar. He was quite highly regarded, Graham Stanton. He died in 2009. But he was a significant Bible scholar of the last half of the 20th century. And in considering this passage, he analyzed it himself. He gave it his own translation, so you'll notice it's in minor respects it's a little different. But here are the portions that he feels were original to Josephus, based on just the word and phrase choice that we find. So I'll read it. About this time lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who did surprising deeds, a teacher of those who delight in accepting the unusual. He brought trouble to many Jews and also many from the Greek world. On the accusation of our leading men, Pilate condemned him to the cross. But those who had loved him from the first did not cease to do so. And to this day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. And if you notice, that reads pretty smoothly, and it sounds very much like what a typical Jew who had traditional Jewish beliefs of the first century, who was simply providing, in effect, a neutral account of what he had heard, not being a believer, but not going out of his way to express a skepticism. But it sounds like a neutral kind of account. You'll notice then what Stanton leaves out as likely additions from a Christian scribe of later times. So these would be the additions. If indeed one ought to refer to him as a man, see, that he was more than human. And the phrase, he was the Christ. And then the phrase, for on the third day he appeared to them again alive, just as the divine prophets had spoken about these and countless other marvelous things about him. Notice he says that was likely an addition. So that's why I say, because it is overwhelmingly likely that the portion about Jesus being seen alive again on the third day was added to original Josephus. It is, we can't simply count that as a rock solid reference from the first century. It is probably not, but it deserved to be mentioned. But there is one more passage from Josephus that, even though it doesn't mention the resurrection, I think we should take a look at it. And so it is from, I'll find my place here. It's from Antiquities of the Jews, this time, book 20, verse, or passage, I should say, passage 200. And I know May hasn't had a chance to rehearse this, but I don't think that will give you too much trouble there.
Oh, from where?
So read from when therefore Ananus. Okay, so
When, therefore, Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned.
Okay, so we can stop there. So now I'll have to describe a little further the context of this. You'll notice there is a priest named Ananus. And what happened was, after Festus, if you remember, he's mentioned in the Bible in the book of Acts, it says after Festus had died, but before a new governor could arrive, during that window of weakened Roman supervision, you might say, it says this Ananus, who was ambitious and aggressive, he took that opportunity when there was no governor in place to carry out a really unlawful execution. And those whom he executed, he says, were the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others along with him. Now, the reason this is significant is this, scholars are by no means, is there a consensus that this was the addition of a Christian scribe. On the contrary, this looks like an original passage of Josephus. And again, it's not something that would need a Christian to write, and it's not something that is particularly hostile to Jesus either. It says that there's a man named James, that the high priest had something against him. He was looking for an opportunity to have him stoned to death, executed, and that this James was the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. Now that phrase, who was called Christ, or in some translations of Josephus, it's rendered the so-called Christ. But in English, the term so-called can almost sound like he's saying that it was phony, and it's really not. It's not saying he was the Christ, as if this were a Christian scribe. It's something Jesus, who was the Christ. He's just acknowledging that there were many people, or a significant number of Jews, who held him to be Christ. He simply makes that note and then moves on. He makes no judgment about it, actually. But in saying that there's James, this James, who was prominent, apparently prominent enough to be known and to be hated by the high priest, this is consistent with the tension we see in the New Testament between apostolic figures and the authorities in Jerusalem. We have information from Paul and from our Gospels that Jesus did have a brother, that he had 4 brothers, the oldest of whom and the most prominent of whom was James. And here's the sort of the interesting part, or the connection. If you remember all the way back in our passage from 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul was speaking about Jesus making several appearances to his disciples. Maybe we'll just go back to that briefly. May's going to grab her Bible there. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And if we turn to chapter 15 and look in verse 7. Okay? So, and May, would you read that for us? So, now this is part of Paul's listing of those who saw Jesus after he rose from the dead.
Just only 7.
Yeah, just verse 7, right?
Then he appeared to James. Oh, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles.
Okay, Paul specifically says that one of Jesus' post resurrection appearances was to James. Remember the other in verse 5, he says to Cephas, the apostles, and then to me also. So Paul, in effect, calls some specific attention to this appearance to James. And from the book of Acts, according to the book of Acts, James became a prominent leader of the church in Jerusalem. Even though he was not one of the 12 apostles, in the book of Acts, he is shown acquiring what we call a quasi-apostolic standing. That is a standing similar to the apostles. Paul verifies this. In the book of Galatians, he calls James and Peter and John the pillars of the church there. So this is acknowledged in more than one of our Christian sources. Now here's the other wrinkle to this, a little bit of information, some confirmation we have from Josephus. From Josephus, coordinating Josephus with our New Testament information, it looks very much in Josephus like we have a confirmation of James's status as a Christian leader. That would account for the hostility from the high priest who wanted to remove him, to get rid of him, which he says he did. And so according to this, and we have other traditions also that James was martyred. But in the Gospels, James and Jesus' other brothers are presented as skeptical of Jesus's claims during his lifetime. And we have more than one source for that. We have a verse in John that says Jesus' brothers were not putting faith in him, just saying that directly. And then we have a verse in Mark which says that Jesus's relatives, his own people, came to get him early in his ministry because they thought he was out of his mind, clearly not having faith that he really was the Messiah, thinking he'd gone off on some kind of a weird tangent of some kind. And now it doesn't say his brothers, but by saying his relatives or his people, then looking at John's information, they seem to go together, and they seem to verify that many members of his immediate family, his brothers would be right in that category, were skeptical of Jesus's claims during his ministry. Also, it is there's no obvious motive why Christians, even if they were, say, freely composing some items about Jesus' ministry, in other words, even if the writers of the Gospels were fictionalizing a bit here or there, why they would invent skepticism on the part of Jesus's close family members. It just would not serve any purpose, really, any propagandistic purpose for them to invent skepticism by those who were closest to Jesus, who'd grown up with him right in the same household. So that's an item of information that is likely to be true. It's unlikely to be invented. And yet at the same time, we have to explain then how James became a believer after Jesus's ministry. If he was skeptical during the time when Jesus was preaching, what caused him to become such a devoted follower of Jesus that he would become a martyr to the faith and would be picked out for that purpose? Obviously, having won the antagonism of the Jewish high priest. All of that, what those are small clues that contributes toward a historical picture. And the picture seems to be, because we have mentioned that other brothers of Jesus, and again we have this from Paul, and from Luke both, that his other also became believers. That something dramatic occurred to cause this change in them. Now that's not a rock, you may say absolutely rock solid proof that Jesus made a resurrection appearance to James or to his other brothers. It's just a contributor, though. It is a small clue. Something remarkable happened to change the trajectory of their lives. And Josephus is valuable because in this passage, where he seems to be just a disinterested historian recording a fact, he quickly moves on from that. He seems to confirm the picture we get of the unlikely conversion of at least one of Jesus' brothers to the faith after his ministry. And that's worth noting. It has some evidentiary value when it's coordinated with other information. Okay, so that takes us through our first century sources. We have a little tidbit. We certainly can't lean hard on the first passage of Josephus. The second one is indirect evidence, but it is positive evidence in favor of the New Testament account. So in our next study, what we'll start to do is look more closely at the details and some of the provenance and the status of our sources. And as you can tell, our main sources are the Gospels. We've got, very importantly, that evidence from Paul, however. And I'll close here making a little note about it. Paul's evidence is especially significant in proving that Christians were believers, that Jesus' closest followers were at the very least firm believers in his rising from the dead from an early point. And that it confirms or simply makes it historically much more likely that there was a body of 12 original disciples, because Paul here mentions it. That, it says Jesus appeared to the 12, and that Peter was a leading member of that group. And Paul's information, as he gives it, it's somewhat incidental. Now, what do I mean by that? Is Paul isn't directly addressing people who, some of whom know nothing about these events. He's talking to other believers. He's talking at a pretty early point in the 50s, somewhere in the 50s AD. So, about 20 some years after Jesus' death. This is early in the development of the Christian church. And he's speaking to people who were in a position to know whether what he was saying was true. And he is not particularly defensive about it. He doesn't go into many details trying to persuade them, because he knows they don't need persuading that what he's saying, because he's saying something that's controversial or something that not many of them are aware of. He's kind of reviewing information, taking it for granted that many of his readers are aware of these things. That is, that the earliest disciples who were based in Jerusalem, that they were persuaded strongly that they had seen Jesus alive after he rose from the dead. This was something that people were in a position to occasionally visit Jerusalem, or there were Christians from Jerusalem who occasionally visited different cities such as Antioch and Alexandria and Rome, and that there was a common fund of oral knowledge and oral testimony that was circulating, and Paul is simply presuming on that rather than sort of trying to make a hard argument to convince someone who didn't know and didn't believe. And so that gives his account a little a particular weight, the early date and so on, and the incidental nature of it. We could look at the Gospels and say the Gospels were specifically written to persuade those who might not know, or at least a significant number might not know, or be only lightly aware, or need some convincing. And they're a little more propagandistic in that way, not propagandistic in the sense of being false, anything like that, but they are making more of a kind of an argument directly to the reader. So that's why Paul's information is it's kind of a helpful anchor that's of a little more historical value viewed from that perspective. Okay, so next time we will get into some more detail and the nature of our gospel sources. What can we say about our sources in general before we descend to details about the resurrection? We'll find that out next time. So thank you for joining us. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you that we've had this time to look into the scriptures and information that we have historically surrounding them. Please be with us to guide and to protect us through times that are still difficult times for many for various reasons. Please be with us and guide us by your Spirit until we're together again. Amen. And we'll see you next time.